Black CEO, insulted by billionaires, wife at Ritz-Carlton Gala by dawn, their $2. 9. B. Legacy collapsed. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. You should be grateful we even let you walk through the front doors. The words cracked through the Ritz-Carlton ballroom like a whip, thin, sharp, poisonous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to polished lips. A chandelier flickered, as if the insult itself had scorched the air. At the center of the marble floor stood Naomi Sinclair. Black, brilliant, composed. Her gown, sleek obsidian silk, barely brushed the ground where a splash of Bordeaux wine now bled across the tiles, an accident that had been turned into a spectacle. Across from her stood Vivian Hawthorne, the billionaire's wife. Emerald gown, tight around a frame sharpened by entitlement, diamonds cascading from her ears like weaponized ice. Her smile glinted with the confidence of someone who had never lost anything in her life, someone convinced she never would. "She doesn't belong here," Vivian announced to no one and everyone, her voice rising above the orchestra. "This is a gala for legacy donors, not walk-ins." A ripple of cruel laughter moved through the tables. A few guests smirked behind champagne flutes. Others simply watched, fascinated by the violence of humiliation, beautiful, wealthy faces gleaming like polished masks. Naomi didn't move. Her fingers rested lightly on her clutch, posture straight despite the sting of hot wine trickling down her arm. She had been shoved moments earlier, an accident, Vivian claimed, but the shove wasn't the wound. It was the chorus of privileged amusement that followed. Vivian stepped closer, her perfume slicing through the air like a cold blade. "Look at you," she sneered softly, loud enough for every microphone in the room to catch. "Dressed like you're trying to convince someone you matter." Naomi raised her eyes, calm, dark, unflinching. That look alone shifted the room's gravity. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the stillness before a storm decides which city to erase. Vivian misread it completely. "A woman like you should know her place," she whispered, leaning in as camera phones lifted like predatory birds circling their final descent. "And it's not here, not among people who built real empires." A murmur slid like smoke across the room. "Is she serious?" "Naomi looks expensive. She better apologize." But Vivian wasn't done. She lifted her hand and snapped her fingers. Two security guards turned instantly, awaiting orders. "Escort her out." Chaise, disrupting the evening. A gasp peeled through the crowd. Naomi's heel slipped slightly in the pool of wine as she stood taller. The red stain trailed down her dress like a wound drawn by an artist who understood symbolism too well. In the glow of the chandeliers, the contrast was theatrical white marble, red wine, black silk. A tableau of dignity under attack. Before the guards could take a single step, Naomi lifted one hand just enough to pause the room, like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. Her voice was soft, steady. "Is this truly how you greet your guests, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Vivian scoffed. "Guests implies you were invited." Silence pressed against every wall. Phones hovered. Even the violinists faltered, a bow screeching off-key before choking into stillness. Vivian smiled wider, sensing victory. "Security," she repeated. "Remove her before she breaks something that actually has value." The cruelty didn't echo. It detonated. Wine still dripped rhythmically from Naomi's gown. Each drop tapped the floor like a countdown. But then, a shift, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The atmosphere tightened. The lights throbbed faintly. The room's collective breath tangled as Naomi slowly lifted her head, revealing eyes that gleamed like tempered steel. This wasn't a woman defeated. This was a woman deciding. "Vivian," Naomi murmured, "you should be very careful with assumptions." Vivian's brows arched, amused. "Or what? You'll complain to management?" Naomi didn't answer right away. She simply let her gaze glide across the ballroom over the donors, the executives, the heirs clinging to old money illusions. Some looked uneasy, others intrigued. A few suddenly recognized her, but too late to warn anyone. And then right on cue, the line slipped into the moment with chilling grace. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Naomi. Vivian laughed, radiant in her ignorance. You see, she said, tossing her hair, this is exactly why people like her should know their limits. But Naomi's eyes had already finished measuring the room and the cost of what would come next. By dawn, the Hawthorne empire would be ash. The ballroom never truly recovered from that moment. It tried clinging desperately to its gilded elegance, its curated ease, its illusion of moral superiority. But the insult lingered in the air like a shard of glass suspended mid-fall, ready to cut the next person who dared to breathe. The orchestra resumed with trembling strings, each note stretched thin, as if afraid of drawing attention. Conversations restarted in fragments, cracked and brittle. A few guests shifted in their seats, pretending to return to normal, but their eyes kept drifting back to Naomi Sinclair, the woman still standing in a pool of wine, her dignity untouched even as her gown bled red. Phones hovered in the air like black vultures. Their lenses reflected the chandelier light, cold and predatory. A few flashes burst from the press table. The narrative was already writing itself. Billionaire's wife humiliates unknown guest. They didn't know her name. Not yet. And that ignorance was the most expensive mistake of the evening. Vivian Hawthorne pretended the moment was over, smoothing her gown as though wiping away the residue of cruelty. She turned to a group of donors and laughed loud, performative, brittle. Honestly, she said, voice ringing like crystal on the edge of shattering, some people just wander into the wrong world. A couple at the nearest table exchanged glances. Not pity, fear. They felt something shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, as if the temperature had dropped, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Naomi finally moved. She bent down, not quickly, not apologetically, but with the quiet, deliberate precision of someone examining the damage done to her reputation just long enough to calculate the cost of repayment. Her fingers brushed the stained silk of her gown, red against black. A wound painted in front of an audience. She rose slowly, the hem of her dress dripping onto the marble. Tap, tap. Each drop echoed like the soft toll of a bell at a funeral no one realized had begun. Her eyes swept across the room, not pleading, not searching for allies, only observing, measuring future witnesses. The murmurs spread again, threading through the tables like a cold wind. Is she going to leave? No, look at her face. That woman's about to do something. I've seen that look before, not good. The security guards, still waiting for Vivian's order to finalize, hesitated. One of them, the younger, swallowed hard when Naomi's gaze met his. He didn't see defiance. He saw inevitability. Vivian stepped closer again, unable to resist the stage she had built out of another person's humiliation. You can go now, she said with a smile too wide, too forced. We've tolerated the disruption long enough. Naomi tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to a song only she could hear. Behind them, a waiter froze mid-step, eyes fixed on her. A few donors put down their forks without realizing it. A woman in a sequined gown whispered, "Something's wrong." A man beside her corrected her quietly. "No, something's coming." The chandelier above them flickered again once, twice like a heartbeat skipping. Naomi spoke at last, her voice a controlled whisper that somehow carried across the ballroom. "Disruption," she said, "is rarely one-sided." A hush poured over the room, thinning the space between every heartbeat. Vivian's smile dimmed, confused, unsettled despite herself. "I don't know who you think you are," Vivian hissed, stepping just an inch too close. Naomi's lips curved, not a smile, a warning. "You will." Then she lifted her chin, brushed one final bead of crimson from her gown, and began walking not out of the ballroom but deeper into it, straight toward the center table where the Hawthorne family name glittered on every donation plaque. Cameras pivoted. Guests leaned forward. Security froze. And somewhere in the back of the room, a single truth began to sharpen into full clarity. This wasn't the aftermath of humiliation. It was the start of consequences. Naomi's footsteps carried her across the ballroom like measured strikes on a war drum. Soft, steady, but reverberating through every ribcage in the room, the marble floor reflected her silhouette in long, quiet strokes, as if even the building itself recognized a shift in hierarchy. The orchestra faltered again. A cellist missed a note. A violinist lowered her bow entirely. No one breathed normally. Conversations thinned into nervous threads, stretching out, snapping, disappearing. At the head table, the donors, the people who believed they were the axis around which the entire night revolved, turned cautiously in their seats. They didn't know what they were seeing, but they felt it, a gravity they weren't used to obeying. Vivian Hawthorne followed close behind, her heels clacking too sharply, her steps too fast. Arrogance always moves a little quicker when it senses it's losing control. "Where do you think you're going?" she snapped. Naomi didn't stop. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge the woman who had tried to write her humiliation into the night's program. Instead, she reached the main table, the one engraved with the Hawthorne family crest, and rested a single hand on the back of an empty chair. Her fingers were steady, her breathing calm. Her gaze swept the polished wood, the embossed menus, the name placards arranged like a coronation ceremony. Then she spoke. "To think," she said softly, "this was supposed to be a celebration." A ripple moved through the table, not of recognition, but of confusion. A bespectacled man leaned toward his wife. "What's she talking about?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Her eyes never left Naomi. Vivian arrived beside her, breath tight, mask cracking. "You're making a fool of yourself," she hissed. "You've already embarrassed us enough for one evening." But the guests around the table weren't looking at Vivian anymore. They were watching Naomi. One of the board members, a gray-haired man with a glass of untouched scotch, cleared his throat. "Mom, perhaps we can help you find your seat." Naomi's eyes shifted to him, slow and deliberate. "My seat?" she echoed lightly. The edges of her voice dipped in something cold. "I know exactly where I belong." Silence clamped down on the room again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was anticipation. Somewhere near the back, a young waitress whispered, "She's about to end somebody's life tonight." Her coworker nudged her elbow. "Girl, hush, you're not wrong." A group of investors leaned forward, sensing a tectonic plate about to crack under the carpet. Naomi finally looked up at the crowd, really looked. Her eyes, framed by the soft shimmer of the chandelier's light, were no longer the eyes of a woman insulted. They were the eyes of someone unveiling truth, one layer at a time. And that was the moment the narrator's voice glided back into the story, slow and deliberate. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here." Now, back to Naomi. Naomi lowered her hand from the chair and straightened her shoulders. "Vivian," she said, finally turning toward her, "you've spent the evening talking about who does and doesn't belong in this room." Her tone wasn't angry. Anger would have made the words too small. Her tone was surgical. "But belonging," Naomi continued, "isn't defined by who stands beside you. It's defined by what stands behind you." Vivian blinked, thrown. "What are you implying?" Naomi stepped closer, not threatening, simply clarifying. "I'm not implying," she said. "I'm reminding." The donors leaned forward, pulses quickening. Vivian frowned. "Reminding who?" Naomi's gaze swept the room, brushing across every face, some intrigued, some afraid, some already piecing the clues together. Everyone. A quiet gasp slipped from someone near the bar. The tension tightened its grip. Naomi's voice dropped half an octave, enough to thread through the air like silk drawn across glass. "You built a night around legacy," she said, "but you forgot one thing." She paused, letting the ballroom hold its breath. "Legacy only stands as long as the person holding it does." Vivian laughed, a brittle, uncertain sound. "And you think you're that person?" Naomi looked her dead in the eyes. "No," she said. "I know I am." And as the room trembled under the weight of that truth, a single realization flickered across the ballroom like lightning. The Hawthornes had humiliated the one woman whose signature, whose power, whose empire they needed more than oxygen, and she had just stopped pretending otherwise. For the first time since the evening began, the ballroom felt small, not because of its walls, tall enough to cradle chandeliers the size of cars, but because everyone inside suddenly sensed they were standing in the shadow of something much larger than a gala. Naomi Sinclair didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet around her worked like an amplifier. Behind her, Vivian hovered with a smile that had curdled into something brittle and strained. She kept glancing at the crowd, silently begging for someone, anyone, to validate her authority. But the room had already shifted allegiance. No one wanted to stand beside the woman who had just declared war without knowing who she'd aimed at. Naomi exhaled slowly, and the story behind her calm began to surface, visible not through words but through the posture of a woman who had learned to own silence the way others owned property. She placed a hand gently on the back of the chair again, more deliberately this time. "Let's give this night the context it deserves," she said. A few people tensed, as if bracing for a verdict. 46 years, Naomi began, her gaze drifting toward the high-arched ceiling, "is a long time to learn how to walk through rooms that weren't built for you." Her voice was soft, steady, the kind of vulnerability that doubles as a blade. "I grew up in East Baldwin, one grocery store, 2 bus routes, 3 nights a week without power." A few guests blinked, surprised. That wasn't a place they imagined someone dressed in obsidian silk could have come from. "My grandmother worked double shifts cleaning houses not very different from this hotel," Naomi continued. "She walked miles to jobs where people wouldn't speak to her, except to ask why she was touching their silverware." A murmur rippled, not pity, discomfort. A mirror had been lifted, and many didn't like their reflection. "She used to tell me," Naomi said, "that dignity is the only inheritance nobody can take, but they'll spend their whole lives trying." Vivian scoffed loudly, trying to reclaim the center of the stage. "Oh, please," she said. "We're not doing the trauma monologue. Everyone has a sad story." Naomi turned her head just enough to meet her eyes. "Some stories aren't sad," she replied. "Some are fuel." The crowd absorbed that line like it was oxygen returning to starving lungs. She continued, "I built Orion Nexus Holdings from a folding table in a 1-bedroom apartment. No loans, no investors, no one willing to take a risk on a black woman with a blueprint." Her fingers brushed the edge of the chair. 24 years later, we operate in 16 countries, employ 84,000 people, and generate revenues larger than the GDP of some nations." A gasp. Someone whispered, "Orion? That's her?" Another answered, "No, that can't be." But it could. And it was. Naomi's expression didn't change. Power didn't need theatrics. It needed truth. "When I accepted the invitation to this gala," she said, "I thought I was walking into a celebration of partnership." Vivian stiffened, finally realizing the danger in Naomi's tone. Naomi went on, her voice sharpening by a fraction. "But partnership requires respect. And tonight, I've been shown everything except that." A man at the table cleared his throat. "Miss Sinclair, are you saying you're involved with the Hawthorne deal?" Naomi paused, just for a breath, enough to let anticipation pool in the room like rising water. "Involved?" She echoed softly. "No, I initiated it." A wave of shock swept across the table. Vivian's face drained of color. Naomi continued, every word precise. "Orion Nexus Holdings is the primary acquisition partner in the Hawthorne Group's $2.9 billion restructuring agreement." Gasps, spilled champagne, a dropped fork clattered like a gunshot. Vivian clutched the edge of the table. That's impossible. My husband never mentioned. He didn't know what I looked like," Naomi said. "None of your board did. I prefer privacy." The room reeled. "And yet," Naomi added, gaze steady, "your family spent the night deciding whether I belonged here." The weight of those words hit the ballroom like a chandelier falling. A woman near the stage whispered, trembling, "Oh my God, she's the signer." Yes, the one signature the Hawthorne empire needed to survive. And the woman they had tried to humiliate out of the room was the only person who could stop their $2.9 billion collapse. Naomi tapped the chair once, a final punctuation mark. I didn't come here looking for a fight, she said quietly. But you invited one. And somewhere in the silence that followed, everyone understood. This story was no longer about a spilled drink. It was about a family who had just offended the architect of their survival. For a moment, the ballroom felt like it was tilting, as if every chandelier, every champagne tower, every elegantly dressed guest suddenly realized they had all been standing on a fault line, and Naomi Sinclair had just pressed her heel down on it. Vivian Hawthorne's confidence shattered first. Her face contorted through three emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, indignation, and finally the creeping edge of fear she wasn't built to hide. She opened her mouth, then closed it again when her voice didn't obey her. But at the main table, the true unraveling began with the man seated at its center, Richard Hawthorne, the patriarch, the empire bearer, the man who had inherited the kind of wealth people assume is eternal. He had watched the confrontation from afar with a smug detachment, certain his wife's cruelty was nothing more than evening entertainment. Now, as Naomi's identity crystallized in the room like a spoken verdict, Richard's spine stiffened. His fingers tightened around his scotch so hard the glass nearly cracked. Naomi turned toward him. Their eyes met across a battlefield of linen tablecloths, crystal wine glasses, and trembling reputations. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her tone balanced between respect and reckoning. Richard rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He offered a polite smile, thin, trembling at the corners. A man accustomed to control, suddenly discovering he might not have any at all. "Miss Sinclair," he said, voice courteous but shaking beneath the surface, "this feels like a misunderstanding." The donors, the staff, the musicians, they all felt the desperation in those words. Naomi raised a brow. "Does it?" Richard swallowed. "My wife, she didn't know who you were." "That much," Naomi replied, was obvious. Vivian flinched. Richard attempted another smile, this one more strained. "If we could speak privately." "No," Naomi said gently. "No more private conversations about public behavior." A hush swept the room again, heavier now, thick with the realization that nothing about the night could be undone. Richard's jaw tensed. He looked around, as if hoping for someone to step in and restore the world to the one he recognized. No one moved. Naomi took a single step forward, and with it, she began peeling back the veneer of the Hawthorne empire. "You built a legacy," she said quietly. "But you also built walls so high you stopped seeing the people outside them." Richard stiffened. "Your company," Naomi continued, "has been bleeding for years. Your debt restructuring is a timed fuse, and your board has been praying the acquisition goes through before your lenders pull the plug." Gasps. A woman at the table clutched her pearls with a trembling hand. Someone whispered, "She knows." Another murmured, "God help them." Vivian grabbed Richard's arm. "Is she lying?" she demanded. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. Naomi's gaze softened, not with pity, but with understanding born from the cost of survival. "You were banking everything on the deal," she said. "You needed discretion, you needed speed, and you needed trust." Richard's voice cracked. We do trust you." Naomi held his eyes. "Do you?" she asked quietly. "Because your wife spent the night calling me unworthy of standing in the room where you expect me to save you." Vivian snapped back with forced bravado. "You're overreacting to a spilled drink. It was never about the drink," Naomi said, her voice suddenly sharp enough to slice the air. "It was about who you believed had value." Richard closed his eyes for a second. A man realizing the cost of another's arrogance had become his own burden. Naomi turned her gaze to the donors, to the board members hiding behind their glasses. "Every empire falls the same way," she said softly. "Not from enemies, from entitlement." Vivian's face flushed crimson. "You can't talk to us like that." Naomi cut her off with a single quiet line. "I'm the only one in this room who can." Vivian staggered back as if struck. A chilling clarity swept the ballroom. Richard finally spoke, his voice thinned by dread. "Please, Naomi, we didn't mean for any of this to happen. The deal, it's crucial. You know that." Naomi's expression remained unreadable. "The deal," she echoed, "was built on good faith." She let the words settle, heavy as thunder. "And tonight, your family broke every piece of it." A tremor moved through Richard's hands. Vivian looked around desperately, hoping anyone would step in. No one did. Because everyone understood exactly what Naomi Sinclair meant. Respect was part of the contract, and the Hawthornes had just defaulted. The silence that followed was not the kind a room falls into. It was the kind a cliff gives before it breaks. Naomi Sinclair stood in the center of the ballroom as if the marble itself had been carved around her. The chandeliers above seemed to dim, bowing in quiet acknowledgement. Every guest had the same realization carved into their expression. The humiliation was over. The reckoning was beginning. Richard Hawthorne opened his mouth, searching for words that could rewind the night, but Naomi had already turned away from him. Her posture was calm, almost serene, the stillness of someone who had stopped absorbing damage and begun calculating consequence. She reached for her phone. Not hurried, not dramatic, just precise the way a surgeon lifts a scalpel. The soft, unmistakable chime of the screen waking up sliced through the tension. Even the orchestra paused mid-measure. Vivian instinctively stepped back. Richard froze. The guests inhaled as one. Naomi spoke without looking at anyone. Rachel. Her voice was level, steady. On the other end of the line, her chief operations officer answered instantly, as if she'd been waiting for this exact call. Yes, Mom, I'm here. A few guests stiffened. They recognized that tone, not obedience, but readiness. The voice of someone accustomed to executing decisions that change the fate of companies. Naomi continued. Initiate the review. Rachel didn't ask which review. She didn't need to. Full scale? She asked quietly. Full, Naomi said. Across all Hawthorne assets. Richard lurched forward. Miss Sinclair, Naomi, please, wait a moment. But Vivian grabbed his arm. You're not going to let her threaten us, she hissed. Naomi didn't turn around. This isn't a threat, she said. It's protocol. On the phone, Rachel's fingers tapped rapidly. Understood. Flagging accounts now. Freezing liquidity streams. Pulling audit logs. Estimated completion. 90 seconds. A collective gasp erupted. 90 seconds. That number alone felt like a guillotine blade lowering. Richard's voice cracked. Naomi, don't do this. We can resolve the misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, Naomi said. Only entitlement. Vivian scoffed, her hands trembling. You think you can just walk in here? And Naomi finally faced her. No, she said. I walked in here prepared to sign your salvation. Vivian flinched. The donors exchanged panicked looks. Phones buzzed softly like insects in the corners of the gala as news alerts began to crawl onto screens, small ripples signaling an approaching wave. Rachel's voice returned in Naomi's ear. Phase 1 complete. Their liquidity ratio just hit negative. Their lenders' auto-alert systems should trigger within minutes. A board member at the table choked on air. Dear God, Vivian's voice trembled. You can't do this. You don't understand what you're. But Naomi cut her off, not with anger, but with something far more terrifying. Clarity. You had the chance to treat a stranger with dignity, she said. Not because of her status, not because of her wealth, but because she was human. Her gaze sharpened. You chose cruelty, Rachel spoke again. Mom, Phase 2 recommends pulling our pending support letter. Without it, their restructuring collapses. Naomi lifted her chin. Pull it. Richard staggered. No, Naomi, stop, this will ruin us. Vivian's voice went shrill. You're overreacting. Naomi stepped closer, inches from her. No, she said softly. I am responding. It was the tone that broke the room, quiet, factual, absolute. The tone of someone who had learned long ago that justice didn't always come from courts or crowds. Sometimes it came from the calm hands of the person everyone thought was beneath them. The chandeliers above flickered again. Rachel's voice returned one last time. Everything's in motion. Withdrawal will hit the wires in moments. Naomi ended the call. No flourish, no announcement. Just the silence of a decision that would reshape an empire by sunrise. Richard collapsed into his chair, his face drained of color. Vivian simply stared, her arrogance dissolving into a kind of shock that left her mouth open but empty of words. The guests weren't looking at the Hawthornes anymore. They were looking at Naomi Sinclair, not with fear, not with awe, but with the dawning understanding that they had just witnessed something rare, retribution without rage, power without performance, justice without noise. Naomi slid her phone back into her clutch with an elegance that made the act feel ceremonial. Then she said, "To no one and everyone, actions have consequences." And the ballroom knew. Theirs were already on the way. The notifications hit the ballroom in waves. First one phone buzzed, then 3 more. Then an entire table lit up like a constellation being born out of panic. Whispers sharpened into audible gasps as headlines began to flash across screens. Orion Nexus withdraws support from Hawthorne Group. $2. 9B. Acquisition in jeopardy. Restructuring deal collapsing. The room fractured. Investors who had spent the evening sipping champagne now scrambled through their alerts. Board members who had laughed at Vivian's cruelty stared at their phones as if watching their own lives evaporate. Even the waitstaff paused, sensing the shift ripple through the air like a pressure drop before a storm. Richard Hawthorne clutched the edge of the table, knuckles white, his breath quickened. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. But it was, and it unfolded with ruthless efficiency. Miles away, in the glass headquarters of Orion Nexus, a team of attorneys moved through corridors with the coordinated precision of a special operations unit. Contracts were being flagged, loan guarantees revoked, letters of intent shredded digitally in real time. Every screen they passed glowed with collapsing numbers, frozen assets, and the unmistakable red indicators of a sinking empire. One lawyer spoke into a headset. "Notify Wellsworth Bank. They'll want to adjust exposure." Another. "Alert the foreign partners this voids their co-investments." A third. "Prepare the public statement. Timestamp it to 11:59 p.m. Back at the Ritz-Carlton, the orchestra had stopped playing altogether. 2 violinists exchanged terrified glances. The pianist lifted his hands off the keys, as if afraid the wrong note might trigger another financial detonation. Vivian staggered forward, mascara trembling. "Naomi, stop this. You don't know what you're doing." Naomi turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "I'm ending what you started." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried. Across the ballroom, a man in a navy tuxedo stood abruptly. "My firm has millions tied to Hawthorne stock. What does this mean for us?" A woman answering her buzzing phone whispered into the receiver. "Yes, I saw the alert. No, I don't know if the company will survive the night." Panic was no longer creeping. It was sprinting. Richard tried to rise, but collapsed back into his chair. "Please," he whispered, the sound frayed. "Naomi, we've worked on this deal for months. This destroys everything." Naomi faced him fully now. "You worked on the numbers," she said softly. "But you ignored the people." The words landed with a quiet, devastating force. Rachel's message appeared on Naomi's phone. "All transfers executed. Exit confirmed. Audit letter dispatched." The final blow. Naomi slipped the phone back into her clutch. Somewhere behind the rows of stunned guests, the Hawthorne family crest displayed on the gala banner flickered, glitching, struggling, fighting irrelevance as if even the projector sensed the empire beneath it had begun to crumble. The room no longer belonged to the Hawthornes. It belonged to consequences. Naomi inhaled once, steady and controlled, then stepped forward into the silence she had created. The silence that now carried the weight of a $2.9 billion collapse. And the night wasn't finished with them yet. By the time the clock struck midnight, the gala was no longer a celebration, it was a battlefield lit by chandeliers. Phones continued to buzz relentlessly, each vibration another crack in the Hawthorne empire. Stock apps refreshed with merciless precision. Red arrows pointed downward, steep enough to resemble a freefall. Conversations dissolved into frantic whispers. "It's plunging, already down 12%. Liquidity freeze confirmed." Is this real? Is this actually real? Vivian stood frozen in the center of it all, her emerald gown shimmering like a relic from a world that had ceased to exist an hour earlier. Her lips trembled as she scanned the room, waiting for someone to rescue her reputation, her certainty, her arrogance. No one moved. Richard's phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the marble. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring at a future he no longer recognized. He looked smaller now, a man watching the empire he inherited drain out through the cracks his own entitlement created. A notification chimed across multiple devices at once. Breaking. Orion Nexus exit triggers emergency review of Hawthorne Group. Analysts predict potential bankruptcy. The murmurs that followed carried pity, dread, and a quiet, sharp satisfaction. Naomi watched the room absorb the truth. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Retribution wasn't the point. Accountability was. A donor approached her cautiously. "Miss Sinclair, did you know it would fall this quickly?" Naomi's gaze was steady. "Foundations weaken long before walls collapse," she said. "Tonight simply exposed what was already broken." Behind them, the Hawthorne banner flickered again, a dying signal. And as the orchestra packed their instruments in shaken silence, every guest understood. By dawn, the empire would not merely be wounded, it would be gone. The Ritz-Carlton was nearly silent by the time Naomi stepped into the chilled early morning air. The city glowed faintly beneath a pale blue sky, the kind that appears just before dawn decides whether to rise gently or burn. Behind her, the ballroom that once pulsed with wealth now sat dim, hushed, and hollow. Staff moved quietly around, toppled champagne flutes, and abandoned seats. The Hawthorne banner had finally gone dark. Naomi didn't look back. Justice didn't require an audience. Her phone buzzed once, a message from Rachel. Confirmation received. Collapse projected within hours. Naomi slipped the phone away. Across the city, lenders were preparing calls, partners withdrawing support, markets recalibrating around the vacuum where the Hawthorne legacy once stood. But Naomi's next step wasn't toward destruction. It was toward restoration. She walked toward her waiting car, the first streaks of dawn catching the hem of her black gown, and whispered the decision she had carried all night. Grandmother's Fund launches today, a foundation for women overlooked, dismissed, or spoken to the way Vivian had spoken to her. A legacy built not on arrogance, but on dignity. And as the sun broke the horizon, warm light sweeping across the city, one truth settled over the morning like a verdict. Power doesn't shout. It simply chooses where to stand. And Naomi Sinclair had chosen well.